There is an airplane out there that pilots consistently describe as a joy to fly, with beautiful handling, a slick composite airframe, a genuinely impressive cruise speed, and one of the best glass cockpits ever fitted to a piston single. Aviation forums are full of people who love it. Used examples get praised every time someone picks one up, and yet the company that made it walked away from the program, shipped the last one out the door, and never looked back. That airplane is the Cessna TTX, and the story of why it failed is one of the more instructive case studies in how a great product can still lose completely. To understand the failure properly, you have to start with what the airplane actually was and what it was actually competing against, because those two things were more mismatched than Cessna ever seemed to fully grasp. The TTX was a low-wing, turbocharged composite single with a side stick, a Garmin G2000 flight deck, built-in oxygen, and a published max cruise of 235 knots true airspeed at 25,000 feet. Its roots were in the Columbia 400, a design that came out of a company called Lancair, went into production, and then collapsed into bankruptcy before Cessna bought the line and rebadged it. The engineering was sound. The airframe was slippery. The performance numbers were real. On paper, it looked like exactly what the high-performance piston market needed, and by the time Cessna was finished polishing it with Garmin avionics and the Cessna badge, it looked even better. But the problem was that, on paper, was not where sales happen. When you look at how the TTX actually performs in day-to-day operation, rather than in a marketing brochure at 25,000 feet with the engine at 85% power, you get a picture that is still impressive, but considerably more grounded. At mask-free altitudes, say 8 to 12,000 feet, where most pilots actually spend their time on a typical IFR leg, the TTX delivers roughly 170 to 180 knots, true on 14 to 18 gallons per hour running lean of peak. Push harder and accept 24 gallons per hour and you can see around 190 knots. Get up into the low flight levels somewhere around 16 to 20,000 feet, and 200 knots on about 16 gallons per hour lean of peak is a realistic expectation. Owner reports on forums consistently land in that range. The SR22T, which is the airplane the TTX was actually fighting for every sale, delivers roughly 190 to 195 knots in the same low flight levels on similar fuel flows, and around 175 to 185 knots at lower altitudes depending on how aggressively the pilot runs it. Plane and pilot testing confirmed 193 knots at 9,500 feet in the SR22T, with the note that most pilots flying turbocharged piston singles stay below 13,000 feet most of the time and expect to see cruise numbers approaching 200 knots in that band. So in real terms, the speed gap between the two airplanes at the altitudes where people actually fly them is somewhere between 5 and 10 knots on a typical leg. Over a 500-mile trip, that translates to roughly 10 to 15 minutes. The TTX is genuinely the faster airplane, and that margin is real, but it is nowhere near the gap that the brochure numbers imply, and it is nowhere near enough to be a decisive factor in what is otherwise a very close head-to-head comparison. The payload problem is where the TTX starts bleeding, and it bleeds consistently across every real-world scenario that matters to the buyers in this segment. The TTX carries a maximum ramp weight of 30,600 pounds and has a typical empty weight around 2,530 pounds, leaving useful load of roughly 1,170 pounds. Fill the tanks, which hold 102 usable gallons and weigh around 612 pounds, and the full fuel payload is approximately 458 pounds. The SR22T, with its 92 usable gallons, lands at a useful load in the range of 1,245 pounds, giving a full fuel payload closer to 700 pounds. That difference of roughly 240 pounds of full fuel payload is the difference between an airplane that can genuinely carry 4 adults and their bags on a realistic leg, and one that requires the pilot to start doing uncomfortable math before anyone gets in the door. 4 average adults at 170 pounds each, plus a modest 40 pounds of luggage, comes to 720 pounds of people and stuff. In the TTX with full fuel, That combination exceeds the useful load by about 260 pounds. To make it legal, the pilot dumps roughly 44 gallons, leaving 58 gallons on board, which is still usable range, but eliminates the padding that makes a long IFR trip comfortable. In the SR22T, the same 4 adults and bags land only about 26 pounds over useful load at full fuel, meaning the fix is offloading 4 or 5 gallons and walking out to the ramp with basically a full airplane. The TTX also has a maximum landing weight of 3,420 pounds, below its maximum takeoff weight of 3,600 pounds. An airplane that departs at full gross is technically too heavy to land again for roughly the first hour and a half of flight. The SR22T shares its maximum takeoff and landing weight, so a pilot can blast out for a $100 hamburger 15 minutes away and land without any calculation required. It is a small thing in isolation, but these small things accumulate into a picture of which airplane is easier to live with across a full range of missions. The SR22T also has a slightly larger cabin, more baggage space, and on later models a 5th seat option. These are exactly the features that matter to the buyers writing the checks in this segment, which are mostly professionals in their 40s and 50s flying with families, not solo speed junkies trying to squeeze every knot out of the cruise envelope. The TTX's published range figures, like most published range figures, require you to accept a set of conditions that almost nobody flies in practice. The 1,250 nautical mile range quoted for long-range cruise settings assumes 25,000 feet altitude, 55% power around 13 gallons per hour, and 45-minute reserves. The SR22T's comparable number is around 1,021 nautical miles at similar settings. In real use, both airplanes resolve into something far more similar. A typical owner running the TTX at 65 to 75% lean of peak in the mid-teens plans for about 189 to 200 knots true airspeed on 16 to 18 gallons per hour and treats 400 to 700 nautical mile legs as the comfortable operational range, with the airplane theoretically capable of stretching to 800 or 900 nautical miles at economy settings with full fuel. SR22T owners working the same altitudes and power settings see very similar practical ranges. Both are 3 to 5 hour, 600 to 900 nautical mile machines in realistic operation, with the TTX holding a small edge at the far end of the envelope that almost never drives a buying decision. Purely on performance, the TTX holds its own and in some respects edges ahead. The problem is that the buyers in this segment were not evaluating airplanes the way a test pilot evaluates an airframe. They were evaluating complete ownership propositions, and one factor had come to dominate that evaluation in a way that Cessna consistently underestimated. Cirrus had spent years building the narrative around CAPS, the Cirrus Airframe Parachute System, and by the time the TTX was competing in this market, the narrative had become structural. It was not one feature among many. For a large portion of buyers, it functioned as a filter. Either the airplane had a chute, or it did not make the shortlist. Spouses who were not pilots, but who were being asked to get into a small airplane for a 7-hour round trip to visit family, had a single question, and the answer to that question determined whether the conversation continued. Insurance environments, flight training ecosystems, and the entire culture around Cirrus ownership had been built around CAPS as a central pillar. Against that, Cessna was offering "Trust our brand and trust your skills," which was a fine message for 1995, but a losing one by 2012. The absence of a chute on the TTX was a major factor in its failure, ranked alongside weak ecosystem support and half-hearted marketing as one of the top reasons the airplane never built meaningful sales momentum. In the final years before Textron discontinued it, the TTX was moving somewhere between 20 and 30 units annually. Cirrus, in comparable years, was delivering hundreds of SR-22s. Over the roughly decade-long period when both airplanes competed directly, Cessna sold a few hundred TTX and Corvallis units in total, while Cirrus moved somewhere in the range of 2,500 to 2,600 SR-22s across the same period. The honest question is how a company with Textron's resources and engineering talent ended up watching that happen while doing comparatively little about the core weakness. The answer sits in a combination of legacy arrogance, cultural mismatch, and the particular way large incumbents evaluate competitive threats. Cessna's identity was built on aluminum, high wings, conservative engineering, and the implicit message that if you flew properly, you did not need a parachute. From inside that culture, caps looked like an admission that the airplane was dangerous, or a gimmick for lower-skilled pilots, or a competitor's marketing trick dressed up as safety. The engineers and executives who grew up in that culture were not asking, what does the market want? They were asking, does our engineering tradition require a chute? And the answer kept coming back, no. Cirrus had started from the opposite direction. They built the airplane around the answer to a different question, which was what would make a non-pilot spouse say yes. Everything else, the cabin dimensions, the door design, the training philosophy, the marketing language, followed from that. The result was an ecosystem, not just an airplane. When Cessna acquired the Columbia line out of bankruptcy, they did not inherit an ecosystem. They inherited an airframe with a good wing and a history of struggling to sell. The response was to add a Garmin panel, put the Cessna badge on it, and lean on the dealer network. It was an incremental bet on brand recognition in a market that had already moved past brand recognition as a primary decision driver. The people inside Textron, who might have raised concerns about the missing chute, faced the classic institutional problem. Standing up in a meeting and arguing that Cessna needed to follow Cirrus's playbook meant arguing that the traditional thinking was wrong, that the heritage was insufficient, and that the company needed to redesign a product it had just acquired around a competitor's core innovation. That is a hard sell in any organization, and especially hard in one with as much history and identity as Cessna. So the message that reached the decision-makers was softened. Caps matters to some buyers, but many traditional pilots do not care. Surveys show speed and support rank highly. The dealer network is a real advantage. The voice of the spouse who said no chute means no deal did not show up prominently in pilot surveys because it was not pilots who were being surveyed. Texas Top Aviation, a training organization that worked with these airframes, described moving production from Bend, Oregon to Mexico as a huge mistake. That move disrupted manufacturing at a critical time and added operational instability to an already struggling program. Cessna never publicly characterized any of these decisions as mistakes. When the discontinuation was announced, the language was the standard corporate formulation about continuously monitoring the market and aligning product offerings with demand. The honest translation was that it sold poorly and they were done. But why did they not just retrofit a chute? The intuitive response is that Textron had the money and the chute was the one clearly fixable problem. So why not fix it? The engineering reality made that calculation far less straightforward than it looks from the outside. A CAPS-class system on a 3,600-pound airplane is not a canister bolted to the roof. When the chute deploys, the deceleration loads travel through the entire airframe at something approaching 10 to 15 times gravity. Cirrus designed the SR22's load paths, reinforced structure, and safety architecture around caps from the start. The TTX's Columbia-derived composite structure was not designed around a whole airframe parachute system. Adding a parachute retrofit to an existing certified composite airframe meant redesigning load paths through a fuselage layup that was never intended to carry those loads, potentially changing mold geometry, adding plies and stiffeners and local thickening at anchor points, and then running the entire revised structure through FAA certification as a new safety-critical system. The weight alone created a secondary problem. A properly engineered retrofit system on that scale would add 60 to 90 pounds to the empty weight of an airplane that was already fighting Cirrus on useful load. Adding the chute while the useful load gap was already around 240 pounds meant either accepting an even tighter payload or seeking a maximum takeoff weight increase, which brought another round of structural substantiation and certification. Every improvement the chute delivered on the spouse test came at the cost of a further degradation on the can we actually load this for a family trip test? The business case for absorbing all of that cost and time on a program selling 20 units per year into a market where Cirrus had already built the fleet, the training infrastructure, the owner culture, and the brand identity was genuinely difficult to close. Textron had money, but that money competed internally against citation programs, Sky Courier, Denali, the Caravan Line, and the Skyhawk and Skylane, which moved in real volume to flight schools and fleet operators. Every dollar allocated to a multi-year TTX chute certification project was a dollar withheld from programs with better return profiles and clearer growth trajectories. The finance argument was not that Textron could not afford it in absolute terms. The argument was that spending it there was a poor use of capital relative to every other option on the table. If the decision to build a chute-equipped competitor to Cirrus had been made when the Columbia was first acquired, before years of slow sales had defined the product's market position, the calculus might have looked different. By the time the sales figures had confirmed that the airplane was struggling, and the question became whether to invest heavily to address the core weakness, the answer from a capital allocation standpoint was to cut losses and concentrate resources on the programs that were working. Mooney ran nearly the same play. The M20 was and remains one of the most aerodynamically efficient piston singles ever built, with genuine cruise speed advantages at low fuel burns that any numbers-focused pilot could appreciate. The handling was precise, the structure was durable, and the pilots who loved them were passionate. The airplane also had a tiny cabin with a difficult door, ergonomics that dated to an earlier era of flying, no parachute, and a company that bounced through ownership changes and financial instability across decades without ever decisively addressing any of those things. The response to Cirrus's rise was glass panels and interior refreshes, the same incremental logic Cessna applied to the TTX, rather than a fundamental reconsideration of what the market was buying. Both companies listened most closely to the pilots who already loved their products, the people who showed up at Oshkosh and told them speed and efficiency were what mattered. The buyer they needed to reach was sitting somewhere else entirely, working through whether to spend $1 million on an asset the whole family would use, and asking questions that the existing fan base never asked. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.